AITAH for going on a trip to Japan alone because my 30MXGF24F is addicted to weed. I've been dreaming of going to Japan for years and have been saving up for it for at least 5 years. I've been with my GF for a little under 4 years, but had been planning the trip before we got together. I told her about my plan a couple of years ago and she wanted to go as well. It meant saving a bit more money, the both of us, but I loved the idea of going together. I'd even toyed with the idea of proposing when we were over there. My ex is addicted to weed. She's one of those 420 blaze it people. It's her personality, to be honest. I can count on my hand the number of times she hasn't been high on the weekends. I even caught her smoking with my mom's funeral last year. This in part has cooled my original thought of proposing and made me think differently about the relationship. We were due to go to Japan at the end of Feb this year for a month. For all of 2023, I told her that she needed to cut back on the weed, that she wouldn't find a fix over there, and the authorities came down hard on people. This was ignored. She was high every weekend for the past 6 months. I told her if she hadn't cut back by the new year, I wouldn't be taking her. She thought I was bluffing until after Nye, where she spent the entire weekend in Nye smoking and strung out. I gave her the money back that she sent me and told her we weren't going together. I explicitly said I'd still be going. She thought I'd canceled the trip. I kept telling her I was still going. We didn't live together, but the week before I changed the locks at my place as I knew how she'd react. I told her I was still going again and that we could talk about the relationship when I was back. MT phone was off for most of the trip. I got back a couple of days ago and there have been hundreds of messages. From her, her friends, her family. She went through all the emotions, angry at me, insulting me, telling me she loves me, saying she hates me. Halfway through she said we were over, more insults and anger, then a few days ago saying she misses me and wants to talk. One of her friends did say she was still smoking the same amount the entire time, if not more. AITAH if I went on the trip alone and don't really want to speak to her again? I sent her back any money she sent me for the trip. I paid the majority of it as I used a lot of my miles and vouchers to get upgraded. First comment, I'm guessing he doesn't spend his time around a lot of drugs or drug users, so without that comparison, strung out probably feels like the correct word. But as a former pothead, I believe what he is saying. I finally quit for lots of reasons, but mainly because it was making me so boring. I can see how someone might have referred to me as strung out if they lacked other vocabulary or reference. People admit that some strains make them couch locked, which is true. It really causes people to be disconnected, zoned out, slow to react, slower speech, poor memory, inability to focus. Now that I'm sober from everything, I really don't enjoy being around people who are high, for all those reasons above. It makes them dull, and there's an inability to fully connect with them. And then not to mention that when I was out of weed, I would truly become agitated and feel urgency to buy more and become preoccupied with obtaining more. So to refer to these behaviors as strung out isn't really that off base. Second comment, I'm guessing he doesn't spend his time around a lot of drugs or drug users, so without that comparison, strung out probably feels like the correct word. But as a former pothead, I believe what he is saying. I finally quit for lots of reasons, but mainly because it was making me so boring. I can see how someone might have referred to me as strung out if they lacked other vocabulary or reference. People admit that some strains make them couch locked, which is true. It really causes people to be disconnected, zoned out, slow to react, slower speech, poor memory, inability to focus. Now that I'm sober from everything, I really don't enjoy being around people who are high, for all those reasons above. It makes them dull, and there's an inability to fully connect with them. And then not to mention that when I was out of weed, I would truly become agitated and feel urgency to buy more and become preoccupied with obtaining more. So, to refer to these behaviors as strung out isn't really that off base. Third comment, AITAH. If you dislike cannabis, you shouldn't be with a daily smoker. You don't need an excuse to not be with them or take a trip with them, but the way you went about it seems really unreasonable. You did not tell her you expected her to be clean by any specific time, aside from simply before you were scheduled to leave. You decided there was a specific time she needed to quit by, decided that time was the most common day of the year to get intoxicated, didn't tell her you decided that, and then after Nye, pulled it out that she did not meet your deadline that she had no way of knowing existed. If you felt that Nye was some kind of deadline for her, that should have been discussed, and you should have had some leniency in changing that deadline to Jan 1st or 2. TBH, it sounds like you have a lot of anger directed at cannabis without cannabis users, and it's not really clear why that is. And it kind of sounds like you might have made this choice on Nye intentionally, as an outlet for this anger, rather than being more reasonable and being more clear with your expectations. You're not Tay because you expected her to quit or left her home when she didn't. You're an asshole for you navigated that process and failed to communicate with her along the way. Fourth comment, AITAH. Unless she has another substance abuse problem, then you are throwing around the word addicted really loosely. And B, why are you dating someone you clearly aren't compatible with? And C, you have a very outdated understanding of weed. For some people, daily use is part of medication, especially for pain management, insomnia, appetite regulation, and some mental health conditions. For some, it is not different than taking a prescribed medication. For some, it is even prescribed. I personally smoke it daily to regulate both insomnia and BPD. High adrenaline situations are a BPD trigger. Marijuana changes how your body releases processes adrenaline in such a way that I am able to navigate these situations without a crisis. You also can't get strung out on weed. Are you like 90% Bible because Jesus? That's a genuinely hilarious way to phrase that. If she actually was strung out, that implies hard drugs like opiates, in which case you may have an addict on your hand, but it isn't to weed. Weed is not really physically addictive like that. Most people don't experience physical withdrawal from it, and those that do. Worst case scenario, she has a little tummy ache and trouble sleeping the following night. It's not like some drugs where people will make really questionable choices in order to get their next high or avoid the drop. An addiction is generally something that negatively impacts her life. Does she get fired from jobs over it? Does she do itty things to friends and family to obtain it? Does she steal to get it? Does she try to sell off possessions she might otherwise want to keep? Does she opt to simply not eat because food takes out of the drug budget? Was she unable to afford to pay for the OP? You already answered that. Her finances appear fine enough that she can put money down towards the trip until afford to get stoned. I honestly don't understand why the two of you are dating though. You have wildly different views and values. You are trying to change her, and it's simply because you don't like weed. She obviously does, so you're probably going to have to learn to accept her as she is, or your relationship won't last. If you do go without her, don't bet on her being there when you get back. It's a petty move, and I would absolutely pick weed over a guy. He would be asking me to sacrifice my mental health for him. That's not worth it. Fifth comment, marijuana leads to mental dependence. There's a big difference between developing a mental dependence and alcohol addiction dependence. Alcohol withdrawals can kill people. It's a horrible disease which can lead to many horrible painful deaths like esophageal bleeding. A person, even in the face of all that, in the midst of dying a painful slow death, will still have a compulsion to drink. Marijuana does not create a compulsion. There are no physical withdrawals to speak of. What happens when you discontinue marijuana use is that the functions of your body being impacted by the cannabis use, such as not having dreams, with become restored. The marijuana user will feel anxious and irritable and off-center, but it is always blamed on the marijuana when it in fact is because the emotions the person was numbing with marijuana as a way to cope, because they haven't learned to use other coping strategies that are healthier or more effective. So in essence, they are rendered stripped of the relief from themselves that they now are facing without any manner of coping. They are two totally different animals. Unfortunately, I'm the case. The biggest reason she is unwilling to yield is because she doesn't want to have to deal with reality and herself. Which is actually similar to alcohol, as many of the stories you'll hear from alcoholics about the early years when they started drinking is when they tried it suddenly they were sociable and PPL seemed to like them. They often talk of drinking to cope with anxiety and just feeling off and awkward. The difference becomes the nature of how dependence develops, and one being physical while the other being emotional mental. I'm not saying using marijuana isn't problematic. It's just that marijuana is not nearly as destructive and compulsory. Marijuana simply leads to poor relationship management, poor performance or work-related issues, and some legal trouble for the most part in problematic users. Alcohol leads to those issues as well as violence, death, ABSA, and many other forms of misery, and leads to psychosis aka delirium tremens, wet brain, cancer, total destruction of the body including multiple organ failure. So, she sounds like she has some things to work on in her life and could stand to cut back, but in my personal opinion, marijuana addiction is a very personal addiction choice that someone has to come to the realization themselves. The main question for anybody who uses a substance is, does use of this substance impact my life in a negative way? Then an honest account. If a person lacks the ability to be honest with themselves, they'll not be able to acknowledge this, and it likely will take greater pain and suffering to bring them to that point. Or maybe it just isn't impacting them all that negatively, and they are being responsible.